As a child, your parents are your world. They are your models for how to behave, how to engage with others, how to see yourself, most importantly. But what happens when those models are deeply flawed? When they use your fears and vulnerabilities not to guide and support you, but to control and manipulate you? Well, a disaster happens. You grow up unsupported, emotionally disoriented, and stunned. Let's uncover this in today's episode through my personal story. Hi, I am Danish, a narcissistic abuse recovery professional. Something terrible happened this morning that reminded me of my dark past. So I thought, why not channel that survival energy into something empowering? My sister, who happens to be a big enabler of her narcissistic parents, tried to emotionally coerce me into compliance by using my biggest fear against me, the fear of becoming like my father. To give you a little bit of background, both of my parents are narcissistic. My father, a malignant one, and my mother, a covert one. My father's actions were self-centered, his attitude dismissive of others' feelings, and his control over family absolute. He was everything I didn't want to be. My fear of becoming like him was my compass, steering me away from his destructive behaviors. But my mother, a covert narcissist, twisted this fear into a tool for her own purposes. Unlike my father, my mother hid her narcissism behind a mask of selflessness and caring. She appeared to be the more compassionate parent, the more reasonable one, and I was naturally drawn to her in search of the nurturing that my father failed to provide. But her apparent kindness was nothing more than a facade. She knew of my fear of becoming like my father and used it as a weapon. Instead of offering reassurance or helping me to build a healthier model of selfhood, she chose to exploit this fear. Every time I resisted her demands, she would subtly remind me of my deepest fear and create a comparison to shame me, and I would naturally give in. She would say, if you do this or that, what will be the difference between you and your father? You both are the same. Her words pierced my heart because they were not just manipulative, they were a form of psychological warfare aimed at breaking my resistance and bending me to her will. Whenever she said those things, I felt smeared in goo. Shame took over. That is where my dissociation started. She used my fear of becoming like my father to coerce me into compliance, eroding my sense of self in the process. In my eyes, this is the cruelest thing you can do to your child as a parent. To shatter a child's forming identity is the biggest crime you can commit. It is an unforgivable sin, and there is no forgiveness for that. This constant comparison to my father blurred the lines between my own identity and the image of the man I feared becoming. I found myself trapped in a cycle of fear and compliance. My actions dictated not by my own desires or values, but by the need to avoid becoming like my father. This coercion, by comparison, is a form of emotional abuse, one that robs a child of their agency and identity, forcing them into a mold shaped by fear and manipulation. To connect the dots so that things make sense to you, my mother has been pushing me to see her husband lately, and I have dug in my boundaries, made it clear that I am not interested in doing so. As a counter-retaliation, she has been sending flying monkeys in my way, one of which is my own sister. The echoes of my past and the wounds of my childhood were starkly reminded to me in a conversation with my sister this morning. She, seemingly following the manipulative agenda set by our mother, suggested that I have to let her father visit me. This was a shock to me as it felt like a direct attack on my autonomy and personal boundaries. It felt as if the script of my childhood was being recited verbatim, as if it were some religious scripture that had to be followed without question. This interaction with my sister caused a rush of memories and feelings. The manipulation, the guilt-tripping, the disregard for my own feelings and boundaries, it was all too familiar. She said, "You aren't any different for pushing people away," and that brought in so much pain. It felt as if I was being pulled back into the painful dynamics of our childhood. It reminded me of how my mother would compare me to my father, implying that if I didn't do as she wished, I would be just like him. Despite the shock and pain that this brought up, it also served as a stark reminder of how far I have come. I have spent years working on healing from the damage inflicted by my narcissistic parents, learning to trust my own feelings, establish healthy boundaries, and reclaim my sense of self. If you have been through something similar, release that shame and those fears, for they are not yours to carry. Free yourself from the burden because it is not something that belongs to you. That comparison does not exist in reality because you're way different than your abuser. Trust yourself and accept yourself radically. That was it for today's episode. I hope you found it insightful and helpful. If you did, let me know in the comments. I'll talk with you in the next one. Until then, let the healing begin and continue.